We start off this edition by taking you straight across to Hong Kong, where the police has arrived at the scene of the protest. They've intensified over the last few hours. The police personnel are now moving towards the Legislative Council building. Remember, the protesters had taken over the government headquarters, occupied it since early evening. They had started making their way into the government complex. The police now have fired tear gas. And this after the protests had intensified as the protesters made their way into the government headquarters, the legislative building, the heart of the Hong Kong government. These protests have largely been centered around the extradition bill, the controversial legislation that the protesters say will curtail their basic human rights. Why is that? Because the bill proposes that suspects can be sent to mainland China, extradited to China, for being tried in the courts there, which are basically governed by the Communist Party regulations. Now, these are the latest visuals that we're getting to you from right outside the Legislative Council building. Protesters had earlier stormed the building, vandalized the structure, smashed windows, taken down metal fences. They've sprayed messages on the walls. These are scenes that are unprecedented. They've not been witnessed in Hong Kong for years now. These are the biggest protests that have been witnessed in over 2 decades. In the latest, the police have fired tear gas as the protesters continue to storm the government building, smashing windows and spraying messages. They have not been paying any heed to the warnings that have been issued by the police teams. They had earlier desisted from arresting any of the protesters, but now the police have made every attempt to clamp down on those protesters. The police, armed with riot shields, helmets, have charged towards the protesters. Demonstrators have now started evacuating the Legislative Council, but of course that's a process that could take hours and hours given the number of protesters who had stormed the building since early hours of the evening. Now, the day began, the 1st of July was marking the day was marking 22 years since Hong Kong was returned to China by the Great Britain. That was the handover that took place on the 1st of July 1997. Earlier in the day, a flag-raising ceremony that marked 22 years since that handover was taking place at the Hong Kong Convention Centre. Similar protests were witnessed there as well, but they have turned violent over the last few hours. These are the latest images that we're getting to you from right outside the Legislative Council, the government headquarters. The building has been occupied by the protesters. The police personnel have been desisting from arresting any of them so far. They had been issuing warnings, asking protesters to evacuate the building, to leave the spot, but those warnings were not working out to the police's liking so far, and the protesters have continued to storm the building, smashing windows, spraying messages on the walls. The police now clamping down on the protesters, firing tear gas. These are the latest images from right outside the government headquarters. What are these protests all about? They have been witnessed in Hong Kong for the last 3 weeks. They've only intensified over the last few hours, especially since today marks 22 years since the handover of Hong Kong to China by the Great Britain. That was on the 1st of July 1997, and which is why today we're seeing an escalation of these protests. The tempers have only escalated on ground. These protests also have been escalating over the extradition bill, the controversial legislation that would have allowed suspects to be extradited to mainland China for trial, and which is why the protesters have been taking to the streets. They have been saying that the controversial bill curtails their basic human rights and could allow critics of China to be extradited to Hong Kong. They're saying that it could mean that the bill serves as a tool for clamping down on dissent, and which is why they have been upping the ante and taking to the streets and intensifying, and these protests have intensified over the last few days. There have been some days of calm. The protests had also subsided for a brief period, but the sentiment on ground largely has been against the extradition bill. the Hong Kong authorities, where do they stand at this point? The Hong Kong government has maintained that the bill now stands suspended, but the protesters are not convinced by that. They say that the bill should be completely scrapped. They want the bill to be completely withdrawn, and they say that the Hong Kong chief executive, the leader, Carrie Lam, should step down because they are not convinced with the manner in which the entire matter has been handled. The protesters have been spraying slogans, messages, vandalizing the structure, the government headquarters. These are scenes that have not been witnessed in Hong Kong, unprecedented scenes that have been witnessed over the last few hours. Some say that these protests come along expected lines, given that the anger has only been simmering on ground against China over the extradition bill. And since today marks 22 years since Hong Kong was handed over back to China 22 years ago by Great Britain in 1997, these protests have only intensified over the last few hours. The police teams now are clamping down on those protests, and we're seeing further clashes between the police personnel and the protesters. The police armed with pepper spray and batons and tear gas. All of these have been centered around the controversial extradition bill that would have allowed extradition to mainland China of suspects so that they could be tried in the courts in China. The protesters fear that the law would allow Beijing to seize anyone that it likes and whisk them off to mainland China on trumped-up charges, and would serve as a tool to clamp down on dissent. And that's the reason why they've been taking to the streets for 3 weeks now. There have been some days of relative calm. There were some days when the protests had subsided for a brief period, but largely the anger has only been simmering on ground. The latest round of protests also sparked by a flag-raising ceremony that marked Hong Kong's handover from Great Britain to China 22 years ago. On the 1st of July 1997 is when the handover took place, and since the anger has only been simmering on ground against China, we've seen an intensification of those protests through the evening today. Let's also tell you where the Hong Kong authorities stand. As far as the extradition bill is concerned, they've maintained that there is nothing to worry about. They've tried to convince the protesters. They've tried to send out a signal that the bill will not curtail their basic human rights, but the protesters clearly are not convinced. They have been taking to the streets for about 3 weeks now. Similar scenes have been witnessed in Hong Kong, but none like the ones that you're witnessing on your screens, where the protesters have taken over the government headquarters and over the last few hours have stormed the government building, the Legislative Council. They've sprayed messages, vandalized the structure, smashed windows, torn apart metal fences. These protests have turned violent once again, and unprecedented scenes have been witnessed over the last few hours. They are said to be the biggest protest in 20 years. These people are out on the streets over the controversial extradition bill also because today marks exactly 22 years since the territory of Hong Kong was returned to China from the British. That's also known as the handover. Protests are not new to Hong Kong, but what's happening this year is being called the biggest demonstration. For one, in terms of the sheer number of people. The demonstration this year has been much larger than usual because of the widespread opposition to an extradition bill. This Fugitive Offenders Ordinance Bill, if implemented, would allow suspects to be extradited to the Chinese mainland to face trial. The move has set off alarm bells, not only within Hong Kong, but also in the international community. The fear is that critics of China in Hong Kong could potentially be extradited to the mainland to face trials in courts controlled by the Communist Party. What's more, it will not be limited to just the locals. Critics fear even foreigners and tourists could be picked up and sent to the mainland under that proposed law. But the government says the fears are unfounded. They say only people accused of serious and criminal offences would be extradited. Hong Kong is a small territory which is now part of China, but it has its own legal system and judiciary. Hong Kong was a British colony. It was handed over to China by the British on the 1st of July 1997. The agreement is based on the principle of one country, two systems. The territory was promised civic freedoms and a high degree of autonomy for a period of 50 years. Judicial independence is guaranteed, but China watches Hong Kong very closely, and the simmering discontent in Hong Kong is threatening to become a big political headache for President Xi Jinping. So the crisis and the protests are of a different scale, although protests have been common in Hong Kong. In 2014, there was the Umbrella Revolution. It mobilized people against proposed electoral reforms. People used yellow umbrellas to protect themselves from pepper spray. The protests ended only after a crackdown by the authorities. In 2003, a new law sought to criminalize sedition and subversion against China. There were protests then as well. They forced the Hong Kong government to withdraw the bill. What happens this time remains to be seen. Carrie Lam, the chief executive of Hong Kong, is seen as being competent, but people think she is ultimately answerable to Beijing. Hong Kong's focus has always been on commerce, but as the protests show, the people are determined to hold on to their political liberties.